Well, good morning, everyone. It is an interesting Wednesday. Before we start, there's been obviously a lot happening in the news. There always is. I thought there was a signal lack of good coverage about this railroad strike situation. The important thing about a railroad strike is that or any strike, there are demands that the union is making, and then there's the company which is not yielding to these demands. No one's been talking about these demands. I had to actually look it up. People are just simply talking about the strike. They want more sick days. They want more. They want a pay increase because that hasn't been keeping up with cost of living and so forth. I remember in 2015. I remember in 2015 when Canadian National Railroad, possibly others, cut wages and cut back on staff, and they were overworking the hazmat conductors who were taking care of the crude oil and compressed natural gas trains. This is coming to a head now. I have no great hopes for the Biden administration's negotiating tactics. They started a cooling off period a month ago when this did not hit the news. This is Pete Buttigieg's time to shine. I'm not seeing him do anything. I guess they say that this is Labor Secretary's bailiwick. But if they were doing something smart, I would say it would be interesting to try to force the somehow be creative. Please be creative, everybody. Please be creative and open up those pipeline situations, or at least some type of transportation with energy, because that's tied into all of this. Who knows? I'm not an expert, but let's hope they solve this, because we don't need that. There's the main thing to be talking about today: tribalism versus nationalism. I think nepotism is something that's in the middle. There's internationalism or imperialism, which also relates to this, but mostly tribalism and nationalism. And as a note, early morning pipe today, one of the most beautiful tin art labels that I think there is. There's a lot of humidity around here lately, uncharacteristically, so good light English blend is best for that. This thing came out of Italy. It was a basket pipe. It was made by a guy who liked to carve it from a slightly bigger pipe. So that was fun to find. Tribalism. Nationalism, understandably, gets very negatively colored from the nationalist movements, the National Socialist movements in the middle of the 20th century. Those are horrible. We shouldn't forget that tribalism has however many thousands of years of brutal history. Something that seems to exist, especially in imperial situations and even in national situations where you have a little bit of tribalism work its way into those systems underneath the surface, sometimes overtly, is nepotism. So why is it called that? That relates to a Latin word for nepo, for it's either, I forget whether it's cousin or whether it is nephew. Julius Nepos was the titular last Roman emperor. Some people like to say he was the last Roman emperor. It doesn't really count. He had no army. But he was deposed. He was deposed by Romulus Augustulus' father. He had to run away up, I think he hung out around Venice, actually, north of there. But he was the last person who had a legitimate title to the Roman Empire. He was called Julius Nepos because he was somebody's nephew. And again, that's a little bit of interesting, maybe not irony, but a little bit of interesting meaning there, that the fact that he was called Julius Nepos is almost a dig at his legitimacy. People talk a lot about meritocracy. Nepotism. I talked about in the last video about imposter syndrome. Nepotism doesn't necessarily mean family. Nepotism really is about kinship. And I think that people feel pressured to do that in places where they feel worried about something, they don't feel trust. Either they're worried about themselves and a threat to themselves that they have to protect themselves with someone they know, or they feel like they owe somebody something. In either case, talent is sidelined. Objectives are sidelined. It's an interesting thing. It's somewhat of a hot button issue. People will talk about a family business. It's a family business, and there are very distinct competing values about this. In this country, there are certain areas where you wouldn't even say the word. To even say the word nepotism would signal you as a bad person. Only a bad person would say that. There's a great story about when, I believe it was Mayor Kelly, in one of the so-called reformer mayors in the 1920s. This might have been the 1890s. I think it was Mayor Kelly in the 1920s. He was campaigning door to door, and the newspapers picked it up because it was such a vivid story, that supposedly a canvassing official was going door to door saying, "Ma'am," he knocks on the door, and an Irish woman steps out, and she says, "What do you want?" He says, "Well, ma'am, just a moment of your time. I represent a candidate for Mayor Kelly. Do you realize that the current mayor of Chicago was creating government jobs that he simply gave to his family, including his sister?" So this Irish immigrant woman, possibly holding some kitchen implement, yells in this man's face, "Well, if he can't help his own sister, what's he good for anyway?" And she slams the door in his face. So it's a completely different way of constructing the world. Whether you live in a fully urbanized kind of nation that has national values, that has economic values, that maybe, or I should say always, to a certain extent, has some type of religious values underpinning it. Or if you live in a place where all of those things are subordinate to ties of family and ties of kinship. Ayaan Hirsi Ali, who is a brilliant person, more quiet now than she has been in years past, but I suppose I don't begrudge her that. Maybe she is saying things and I just haven't noticed as much as I have in the past. About a year and a half ago, or maybe a year ago, she had a very, very good piece on tribalism. She grew up in Somalia. She knows what tribalism is. She grew up in Somalia. She had a very successful career in both the Netherlands and the United States. So she knows both cultures. She knows both systems. You'd be hard-pressed, I think, to find anyone who has seriously lived a tribal lifestyle who thinks that it's better than a national lifestyle. There's a great show called The Descent of Man, which you can look up online. Jacob Boronovsky is the guy who does that and talks about cultural evolution. One of the things that he settles on is he talks about the nomadic goat herders. And I think this was somewhere in Central Asia, nomadic goat herders, and he talked about the yearly life rhythm that they have, migrating from their summer camps to their winter camps, the most dangerous part of the year being getting the goats across the river, the goats and your families and everybody. And if the old people are too old to make it across the river, you got to say goodbye to them. And in the context of all of this, he said that anyone who thinks being a nomad is preferable to living in a settled city hasn't been a nomad for very long. With all the hashtag van life, what I would consider nonsense happening today, there are some people who push back against that. And whenever you have a civilization which is getting old and failing to adapt to new circumstances, you get these kinds of underground romanticist movements pushing against it. But You had that happen in the 1830s with the Romantics. You had it again in the 1890s with different Romantics. You had it very heavily in the 1960s with the counterculture, and to a certain extent you're having it now in a different way. And systems of cities don't always, not always, they simply don't last forever. Right now we have a housing crisis. Right now we have a homelessness crisis. And I think it's a very important time to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot of self-hatred regarding civilization in general, Western civilization specifically. And I'm not sure what's exactly going to happen, but the difference between tribalism and nationalism, with imperialism and nepotism mixed in, needs to be worked out. So we'll see what happens with that. Hope everyone has an excellent day. Ben Shapiro didn't mention choo-choo trains yet in his podcast. I don't think he will. He's upset about that strike. You win Ben Shapiro bingo if he says choo-choo train and my wife is a doctor in the same podcast. So, no, I love his show. Seriously. Ben, I agree with you between 45 and 55% of the time. Thanks for listening.